Ray Dolliver had been appraising farm estate equipment in southern Indiana for 19 years, and he had learned early on that most farm estates tell the same story if you know how to read them. You walk the property in a particular order. You start with the machine sheds because that's where the value is. You move through the outbuildings, the grain storage, the shop. You note what's been maintained and what hasn't, because maintenance tells you something about the person who ran the place. And that context matters when you're putting numbers on things. By the time you've walked a property for 2 hours, you have a reasonable picture of how an operation was managed and what it's worth. The Alderman estate in the fall of 2019 followed that pattern for about an hour and 40 minutes. The farm was located 7 miles outside of a small county seat in the southern part of the state, on ground that had been in the Alderman family since the 1940s. The man who had run it, a farmer named Carl Alderman, had died in August at the age of 79. He had farmed alone for the last 11 years since his wife passed and had no children. The estate was being handled by a nephew in Indianapolis who had visited the farm twice in his adult life and had no particular knowledge of what was on it. Ray had been contacted through the attorney handling the estate, which was how most of his work came in. He had driven out on a Tuesday morning in October, met the nephew at the end of the lane, walked the property in his usual order, and by 11 o'clock had a working inventory of everything he'd seen and a reasonable sense of what the auction would bring. Then the nephew mentioned there was one more thing, out in the back field, past the tree line behind the second barn. He wasn't sure what it was. He'd seen it when he walked the property the first time after his uncle died and hadn't known what to make of it. Ray walked back there with him. It took about 4 minutes to get through the tree line to the open ground beyond it. What he found changed the character of his entire morning. The tractor was a Massey Ferguson 285, which Ray recognized immediately. He had appraised dozens of them over the years. They were reliable machines, well built, common enough in that part of Indiana that seeing one on an estate was unremarkable. This one had been sitting in the field for what looked like several years. The grass had grown up around the tires and there was weathering consistent with outdoor storage, but the machine itself was not in bad structural shape. Someone had parked it rather than abandoned it. The difference is visible if you know what to look for. What Ray did not recognize was what was attached to the 3-point hitch at the rear of the tractor. It was a fabricated piece of equipment, homemade, clearly, built from steel stock that had been cut and welded with a level of skill that suggested someone who knew what they were doing. It was not crude work. The welds were clean, the proportions were deliberate, and the design showed evidence of planning rather than improvisation. Whoever had built it carefully and had built it to do something specific. Ray spent about 15 minutes walking around it and looking at it from different angles. He had seen homemade attachments before. Farmers build things, modify things, adapt equipment to specific tasks all the time, and some of it is rough and some of it is surprisingly sophisticated. But in 19 years, he could not recall seeing something this deliberately constructed that he could not identify the purpose of. It had a primary frame that connected to the hitch points in a standard way, so it had been designed for this category of tractor or one close to it. From that frame extended a horizontal crossbar, and from the crossbar hung a series of vertical elements, 4 of them, spaced evenly, each terminating in what appeared to be a curved contact point of some kind. There was a linkage system connecting the vertical elements to a central actuating mechanism that Ray believed would be operated from the tractor's hydraulics, though he could not fully trace the hydraulic connections without more time and better light. He took photographs from every angle he could manage. He asked the nephew if his uncle had ever mentioned it. The nephew said he had not. He asked if there were any papers or notes in the farm shop that might explain it. The nephew didn't know. Ray finished the rest of the estate inventory, gave the nephew his assessment figures, drove back to his office, and sat down with his photographs and tried to figure out what he was looking at. He was not a man who let things go easily. That was both a professional asset and his wife would have said, a personal characteristic that had its limitations. He had built his appraisal practice on the principle that accurate assessment required understanding context, and context sometimes required more investigation than the client was paying for. He was not being paid to identify the attachment. His job was to value the tractor, and he had done that. Valued it as a 285 in the condition it was in, with the notation that it had a homemade attachment of unknown purpose and unknown value. That was professionally sufficient. But he wanted to know what it was. He started with the photographs, going through them systematically and trying to match the design to anything in his experience or in the reference materials he kept. Farm equipment has a logic to it that usually makes function readable from form. You can look at most implements and understand what they are intended to do to the ground or the crop or the material they're working with. The vertical elements with curved contact points suggested something that interacted with the soil or with plant material. The hydraulic actuation suggested the contact points moved in some way during operation, raised, lowered, angled, or rotated. He called 2 dealers he had worked with for years. Neither of them could identify it from the photographs. One of them said it reminded him vaguely of a specialized transplanting mechanism he had seen once, but he wasn't confident in that reading and said so. He sent the photographs to a retired agricultural engineer he knew from his work with a State Farm Bureau committee, a man named Harold Swick, who had spent his career designing and evaluating farm equipment and who had a memory for machinery that Ray had found useful on several previous occasions. Harold called back 2 days later and said he had some thoughts, but wanted to see the machine in person before he committed to a theory. Ray drove back out to the Alderman farm on a Saturday morning with Harold Swick in the passenger seat. Harold was 71 years old and moved carefully, but once he was standing beside the attachment, he became focused in the way that engineers become focused when something technically interesting is in front of them. He spent a long time looking at specific elements without saying much. He traced the linkage system with his fingers. He examined the contact points closely. He asked Ray to help him check the hydraulic connection points. After about 40 minutes, Harold straightened up and said he had a theory, but that he wanted to talk to someone before he stated it with confidence. He took his own set of photographs and said he would follow up within the week. Ray, by this point, was genuinely curious in a way that had moved past professional interest. He had called the nephew in Indianapolis and explained that he was doing some additional research on the attachment at no additional charge, purely because he wanted to understand it. The nephew had no objection. He was a corporate attorney with a farm estate to close and no interest in the equipment beyond its dollar value, which Ray had already provided. Ray began working on a parallel line of inquiry. Carl Alderman had farmed alone for the last 11 years, but before that he had farmed with his wife, and before that he had been part of a small farming community that still existed in fragmented form. Ray asked the estate attorney for whatever background information the file contained. He talked to the county extension office, which had records of farms in the area going back decades. He drove into town and talked to the woman who ran the local historical society, which turned out to hold a modest archive of photographs and documents related to farms in the county. He was looking for anything that would tell him what Carl Alderman had been trying to do with a piece of custom equipment that he had built himself and parked in a back field and never, apparently, mentioned to anyone. He also, in a move that surprised even himself, drove out to the property a 3rd time and spent an hour in Carl Alderman's shop. The nephew had given him access without hesitation. The shop needed to be inventoried anyway as part of the estate, and Ray was already familiar with the property. He spent the hour not appraising but reading. A shop tells you about a person in ways that a house doesn't. A house reflects choices about comfort and presentation. A shop reflects how a person actually thinks. Carl Alderman's shop was organized in the way of a man who understood systems. Tools were grouped by function and stored consistently, which meant he always knew where things were and always returned them to the same place. The workbench had a solid vise on the left end and a clean surface that showed evidence of regular use but not of neglect. The welding equipment was well maintained. There was a steel rack along the back wall that held stock material, angle iron, flat bar, square tube, in lengths that suggested someone who bought material with specific projects in mind, rather than speculatively. On the wall beside the welding station, someone had tacked up a series of hand-drawn sketches on graph paper. Most of them were faded and curled at the edges from years of exposure to the shop environment. They appeared to be design drawings, rough but deliberate, with dimensions noted and key features labeled in a small, precise handwriting. Ray photographed them all. What he found, piece by piece, over the following 2 weeks, was a portrait of a man he had never met and would never meet, assembled from secondary sources the way such portraits sometimes have to be assembled. Carl Alderman had been a methodical farmer with a strong mechanical aptitude. Everyone who remembered him mentioned the shop, which had been well equipped and well organized, the shop of a man who repaired his own equipment and understood it thoroughly. He had no formal engineering background, but he had spent years doing the kind of practical problem-solving that develops its own rigor over time. The woman at the Historical Society, whose name was Diane and who had lived in the county her entire life, remembered Eleanor Alderman specifically. She described her as a practical woman, not someone given to romantic notions about farming, but someone who had wanted to do something with the land that was hers as much as Carl's, and that reflected her own thinking rather than just inheriting the decisions he had already made. The row crop operation was Carl's operation, inherited from his father, run on his judgment. The specialty vegetables had been Eleanor's idea, Eleanor's design, Eleanor's relationships with the buyers. Diane said she had bought tomatoes from Eleanor at the farmer's market for several summers running. She said Eleanor knew her product thoroughly and priced it fairly, and was not a person who wasted words. In the late 1990s, Carl and his wife Eleanor had shifted a portion of their acreage to specialty vegetable production, a modest operation supplying a regional distributor and a couple of farmers' markets within driving distance. It was not a transformation of the farm. It was an additional enterprise that Eleanor had largely driven and Carl had supported. The specialty production had run for about 8 years, through the mid-2000s, before Eleanor's health began to decline and the demands of managing it became more than made sense. The Extension Office records showed that Carl had attended several workshops during that period on mechanizing specialty crop operations. The challenge of applying standard farm equipment to tasks that conventional equipment was not designed for. Specialty vegetable production at a small commercial scale is labor-intensive in ways that row crop farming is not. And the economics of it often hinge on whether you can reduce that labor intensity without the capital investment of purpose-built specialty equipment. Harold Swick called on a Thursday evening, 12 days after their visit to the farm, and said he had consulted with a colleague who specialized in specialty crop mechanization and that they had reached a conclusion they were both reasonably confident in. The attachment was a transplanting assist mechanism. Specifically, it appeared to have been designed for transplanting seedlings into prepared ground. The vertical elements were designed to open a furrow and place a seedling at a consistent depth, and the curved contact points were soil closing elements that would firm the soil around the transplant after placement. The hydraulic actuation controlled the depth and the closing pressure. The 4-unit arrangement suggested it was designed to transplant 4 rows simultaneously, which at the scale of a small commercial vegetable operation would have represented a significant time savings over hand transplanting. Harold walked Ray through the design logic in some detail. The furrow openers were angled in a way that reduced soil disturbance ahead of the transplant zone, which mattered for certain crops, where root competition from disturbed soil could affect establishment. The closing elements were curved rather than straight, which was the more sophisticated approach. Straight closers tend to smear rather than firm, especially in heavier soils, and southern Indiana ground runs heavy in places. Someone had thought about that. The hydraulic connection used the tractor's existing rear remote outlets, which meant it could be operated without any modification to the tractor itself. That was practical and deliberate. The 285's hydraulic system had sufficient capacity for the actuation load the attachment required. Carl had known his tractor's specifications and had designed within them. It was, Harold said, a genuinely clever piece of work. Purpose-built transplanting equipment for small commercial operations existed, but it was expensive and not always well suited to the specific conditions of a given farm. What Carl Alderman appeared to have done was design a version specific to his ground, his tractor, and the crops Eleanor was growing, using his own fabrication skills and his knowledge of the equipment he already had. Ray mentioned the shop drawings he had photographed. Harold said that explained the quality of the result. A man who drew his designs out on graph paper with dimensions was a man who thought the problem through before he picked up a welder. Harold said he believed it had probably worked reasonably well, based on the design. He said the man who built it had understood the problem he was trying to solve. He said that in his career he had seen purpose-built commercial equipment that was less carefully thought through. Ray sat with this information for a day or two before he fully understood what it meant in human terms, which was different from what it meant in mechanical terms. Carl Alderman had built a piece of equipment to help his wife. That was the whole story, reduced to its simplest form. Eleanor had been running a specialty vegetable operation that was labor-intensive and physically demanding. Carl, who understood machinery and fabrication, had designed a solution that would make the transplanting work easier and faster. Had built it himself because buying purpose-built equipment was expensive and because he was capable of building it himself. He had mounted it on the Massey Ferguson that he had been running for years and that he knew thoroughly, so that the tractor and the attachment worked together as a system. The timeline fit. The attachment appeared to have been built in the late 1990s or early 2000s, based on the materials and the fabrication style. Eleanor had died in 2008. The tractor had been parked in the back field at some point after that, parked, not abandoned, which meant Carl had moved it there deliberately, which meant he had made a decision about what to do with it. Ray thought about that decision. He thought about a man in his late 60s, running a farm alone after his wife died, going out to the machine shed and seeing an attachment he had built specifically for work that Eleanor had done, and that would not be done anymore. He thought about what you do with something like that. You can't throw it away exactly. You can't repurpose it easily. It was designed for one specific task. You can't keep it in the main shed where you see it every day. You park it in the back field, out of the way, present but not in front of you. Carl Alderman had kept it for 11 years, had maintained the tractor it was mounted on, at least to a point, had not disposed of it, had not told anyone about it, apparently, not the nephew, not the neighbors Ray had spoken to, not anyone in the Historical Society's records. He had simply kept it in the backfield past the tree line, where it had sat for more than a decade until an appraiser with more curiosity than the job required walked back there on a Tuesday morning in October and started asking questions. Ray filed his final appraisal report on the Alderman estate in November. He valued the tractor and the attachment separately, noting that the attachment had no established market value as a commercial implement, but had demonstrable fabrication quality and historical significance to the estate. He included a summary of what he had found in his research, the specialty crop operation, Eleanor's role in it, the probable purpose of the attachment, so that the estate record would contain an accurate account of what the piece of equipment was and why it existed. The nephew read the summary and called Ray to say he hadn't known any of that about his uncle. He said he hadn't known about the vegetable operation, hadn't known his aunt had run it, hadn't known his uncle had built anything like that. He was quiet for a moment on the phone and then said it was strange to learn things about a person after they were gone. Ray said that in his experience it was more common than people expected. The estate auction was held in the spring. Most of the equipment sold to neighboring farmers and dealers in the ordinary way of these things. The Massey Ferguson 285, with its homemade attachment still mounted, drew some attention from people at the auction who wanted to know what the attachment was. Ray was present and explained it to the people who asked. The tractor and attachment were bought by a man who ran a small diversified operation in the next county over, not because he had an immediate use for the transplanting mechanism, but because he recognized the quality of the fabrication and thought the machine was worth having. He said he'd figure out what to do with the attachment. Ray believed him. He drove home from the auction in the late afternoon, with the fields on either side of the road in the particular bare condition of Indiana ground in early spring, and thought about Carl Alderman, whom he had never met, building something careful and useful in his shop on winter evenings, mounting it on the tractor he knew best, and driving it out to the back field sometime after 2008 and leaving it there. 19 years of walking farm estates, and Ray still found that some of them told him something he hadn't expected to hear. This one had told him about a man who built things for the people he loved, and who didn't know what to do with what he'd built when the person was gone. That was the story. The Massey Ferguson was just where it lived,